Thanks everybody for attending. I realize this is I think the last ones of the day. I think it's the last go round. Oof. Who else is exhausted? Wow, those are bright lights. We got kind of a big room for not a whole heck of a lot of people, all things considered. Feel free if you guys want to move in a little more, or not. All right, so anyways, if anybody was anybody here ever make it to either one of the two other sessions that I did today? All right, so you guys are going to see the jellyfish one more time. We talk about the jellyfish all the time. You're going to get to see it one more time. Everybody else, hopefully it's new. Same rule applies as to the last one. If somebody walks in 5 minutes late, I'm going to say, hey, guys, thank you so much for attending. Come see us at the booth. I appreciate it. And I want you to go, yeah, and applaud, because that person's going to be confused. And we need a little chuckle at the end of the day here. We've done it twice already today. All right. We are here to talk about how RPA, our friend, fits in to IAM, or if we want to go IGA. I'm going to try to keep a little bit of energy going on. This is my third one of the day, and just like you guys, this is exhausting after a while. So we're going to try to move through. I don't have a whole heck of a lot of slides because this is about half the time of the other event, speaking, brain function not working. So we're going to try to keep this going. First things first. Okay, now it did it. Oop. Where did my second? Oh, it says I'm on slide 6. I don't know how that happened. All right. There we go. Wow, that was unexpected. So how RPA fits into, again, that IGA and IAM program. All right, we say program. Why do we say program? And I'm stealing a little bit from some of my earlier presentations. When we're talking about IAM, we're talking about quite a few things that fall within this. I will show you said jellyfish, I promise, and we're going to talk about where things fit in there. We also have what are some of the challenges that everybody's seen. Hopefully, if we can do this well, we'll have a couple of minutes for questions, but if not, because this is the last one of the day, we can keep it going, or you can come up to me afterwards. On top of that, I got a couple other people sitting in the audience here that will lend a hand also from IDMWORKS. All right, that way we can divide and conquer. All right, so this is the shame self-promotion slide. I don't spend a lot of time on it. We don't need to spend a lot of time on it. It's mostly, hey, we've been around since '04. We're full IAM life cycle, blah, 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 blah. Just want you to know they didn't get us off the streets. If you want more information, we do have a booth. You can see the booth because we're there with the guy screaming at the top of his lungs going, IDMWORKS, blah. That guy. He looks like Gene Simmons. He might be Gene Simmons. We just don't know for certain. That's us. Now let's go into the fun part. All right. First, when we're talking about bots, some organizations, they got a couple. Some are into the tens of thousands already at this point, depending on the type of institution. We have to make a determination as an entity, where do they fit in within the IAM spectrum? Do we treat them like every other user? Do we treat them like a privileged account or elevated type account? And the answer to both is yes, and also no. And we're going to get into a little more of the details on that. I love to start with ambiguity. So first and foremost, when we're talking about how does this fit into IAM, we have to say what are the core capabilities from an IAM perspective, and how does it apply? So as an entity, how does this fit in? Well, you see our core, we call this our jellyfish. From the top, it looks like a circle like anything else, and you're going, that doesn't look like a jellyfish to me. But you know what, when you look at the top down on a jellyfish, it's this billowy sort of round thing. So we'll turn it on its side and we'll see why it looks like a jellyfish in a moment. But the core competencies start from the administration standpoint. Identities and their entitlements. Well, we already know that identities can be human and non-human. When we're talking about the user base, you got your contractors, consultants, vendors, employees, that would help. And on the consumer side, they can be customers, among other things. Well, when we get to the non-human, where this really tends to fall into place, that includes, outside of bots, things like system and service-related type accounts and the like, so server to server. The reason I bring this up is these tend to fall somewhere in between when we're talking about bots. In some instances, we treat them like we would a human user, and in a lot of instances, we treat them similar to the application-to-application password model, where we say, okay, these need to be considered of the privileged state, and we want to talk about what those options are. Now, I don't want to get into the vendors too much, other than to state that it's an interesting ecosystem going on right now, in that, especially from the privileged side, you're seeing vendors hook up with the guys doing RPA, the bot guys, I'm just going to call them for short, so that they have bots that can manage the privilege side tied in to that privileged product. We can talk about specific vendors on the side, because one of the things we're not supposed to do in these is go down that specific vendor side. But they are out there, and I'm happy to have a further discussion in that regard in this. So again, to go back to this, that's the identities, the entitlements around them. The next piece, and where we have a lot of work to do on this, is the access side, which is two things, auth and auth Z. Right? Authentication, how do I get in? And once I'm in, what am I allowed to do? Well, that auth Z is a big ticket item when you think about it from the bot perspective. We have to be real careful, because if we're not watching, we're not keeping track, this is ripe for breach. Bless you, by the way. Last but not least is the intelligence aspect of this. This isn't just reporting and monitoring, it's what are we doing with this? If we're not taking that next step, if we're not saying, okay, from an analytics standpoint, what can I do with this? Can I take action? A lot of organizations right now, notification comes up or an event. What are they doing with it? A lot of organizations aren't doing much of anything with it. They're like, oh, yeah, we're doing the event management side. What happens when you have one? Nobody's really looking at it. So we have to understand that we can't stick with that paradigm if that's the case. All right. End of the day, we want to make sure the right entities, that includes bots, are getting the right access to the right thing at the right time and for the right reasons. And just as important, we have to be able to prove that we can do that. I used this in an earlier one. If I can't tell you that it was Colonel Mustard with the candlestick in the library, then it doesn't truly exist. I have to be able to prove it. All right, I was so much more animated in earlier sessions. This really is getting there. All right, so we turn the jellyfish on the side. And when we're saying, where does this fit into IAM, all of a sudden, wow, we have a lot to deal with here. Many of these aspects tie back to any entity. Therefore, bots are included. And we'll get to the bot-specific stuff shortly. But to take a look at this, we can ask ourselves, how does it fit in? Segregation of duties. Do we need to make sure, from a bot perspective, we're not violating SOD? The answer is very simple, yes. Do we have to manage these life cycles for the bots, similar that we would any other system, account, user, and so on? The answer is yes. These are all standard IAM criteria. We have to treat these entities with the same respect. Resource management, if they tie in from a resource perspective, which a lot of times they will, is there an account that this utilizes? There's your resource. It's an entity. It's tied. It is. Therefore, it's part and parcel. Identity data as it relates. Well, if your bot is handling said data, that's where that one comes into play, versus when you have a human and you don't want their data to get out. So there's a little bit of delineation there. One is more on the management side. And then so on and so forth. We're going to get a little deeper in terms of authentication, authorization shortly. Yeah, we'll tie a couple in real quick before we move on. I'm used to these 50-minute sessions, so I got to get my timing a little bit better here, guys. So authentication is a very big one. And this tends to be the big ticket item for a lot to start with, and then the authorization being the second piece, access. Access has been the biggest headache for organizations when it comes to bots. Authentication, authorization. One, let's talk about how they authenticate. Are we going passwordless? Are they actually using password in a set of credentials? If they're using a set of credentials, and let's start there, there is an actual account with a password. We have to be very proactive in terms of the management. This question gets asked a lot, and it's, for example, hey, I've got a bot that does so-and-so, whatever said tasking is. Similar to what we do on a system or service side, we're setting and forgetting. We put in a credential set, and nobody ever changes it. Most organizations aren't following the rule even where your user set, where you're like, oh, change it every 60 or 90 days. Not that you should necessarily, you should have different policies for that. However, if there's no change there, no forcing of the change, similar to what happens with a lot of orgs on the application to application. I have a server that talks to another server and I have a non-human account. What do most orgs do? They're not changing the passwords ever. Or they're doing it so sporadically that it's a best effort methodology. Well, from a solutioning point of view, we want to talk about how to get over that. The easy way to do it, so to speak, or the easiest model, I should say, is similar when you look at the PAM solutions out there, the privileged account, access, however you want to put it for the middle letter, the PAM solutions to manage it. But the tricky part was getting that bot to invoke that. Therefore, now you're seeing from the vendors, and that's that vendor piece I was referring to, that they are building it into the system so that you can inject very easily. Let's say change it every 24 hours, one-time use, change every week, whatever said policy is, and automate that out of the privileged account management tool. If it's a mission-critical system, we're seeing organizations change hourly in some cases. All right. We'll get a little more details as well. All right. Keep this thing going. Well, we hit privileged. Well, you know what? Let's jump ahead for now. We can come back to it. I only got 13 minutes. Let's talk about the challenges. I kind of did this in reverse. I did this on purpose in reverse. I wanted to show the jellyfish first and foremost so you saw what we were dealing with. I went back and forth on whether I should show this one at the end or not, because the challenges are now the drivers that tie back to that. So first, the question always comes up, how are we managing the bot identities? I don't want to just definitively read this to you here, but there are some pretty succinct questions. And yeah, I put bot in quotes each time, so you can get mad at me for that because I do it consistently. How are we treating them? Do we treat them as a standard user? Likelihood is no. We're treating them, hopefully, from the privilege aspect. However, some of the bots are so basic in their functionality that we do have a little bit of leeway to treat them similarly, right? We can do an auto-provisioning model, for example, auto-provision these accounts, manage them in a similar fashion to the human side. However, typically we want to see a better password policy set and other authentication factors. The other authentication factors is the fun part. Who owns this? Who owns the ID? Who bears the responsibility for the life cycle of the bot, especially when we have thousands of these things? But at the end of the day, we must tie these back to individual owners. Even if it's a one-to-many relationship, if I own 1,000 of them, of which you then can, to go back to the jellyfish, from an entitlement point of view, have an actual attestation and certification process when needed. They do come into the mix because a lot of bots, they get missed over time. So we want to be able to have a reasonable process to go through and make sure that the functionality is still what it needs to be, the rights and obviously the entitlements therein. And believe it or not, we can utilize even the role model to go back to role-based access control and build out a specific role model for said bots so that we can lock down from an access control mechanism. Another option, couldn't get the word out there, is even on an ABAC model, in which case we further lock down through fine-grained authorization. Now we're talking the authorization aspect by stating, here is very fine-tuned based on what those attribute values that are assigned to said bot, what it can do. Not once I got in the door, once I'm there, what am I allowed to do? And lock that down even further. Okay. All right, let's keep this going. From a traceability perspective and identity, do the bots consume licenses? And this actually has been kind of a big one for orgs that have the tens of thousands of bots out there. What licenses do they consume? Do they? And this one's a little less on the technical nature. Yes, from a provisioning perspective, we want to get them in and get them out if that's the case. But you also have to watch your vendors on this one because a lot of them have carve-outs. And you want to take advantage of those for non-human accounts. So if they're placed under the non-human entity status, You may actually get away from a licensing perspective. Next up, how are we going to manage those bot entitlements? Well, that's a good question. How are we going to manage them? Do we have the rules and the understanding up front? Do we understand, for example, if we want to use a role model, do we have a well-defined model? Or if we're using something of native, such as like 80 groups, for example. Do we understand what we're putting these bots into from an entitlement perspective so that we can manage not just the entitlements, but then as we're creating them, if we're, say, utilizing our auto provisioning, if we're tying then those accounts into our privileged account management? Do we have a defined process for the access, I say request, but it's the full life cycle, new, change, remove? Do we time box these, for example? It's 30 days. After 30 days, it's going away. They require different rules typically than we do for our standard user set, but we have all the technology typically in place to do so. Policies, procedures, and the technology surrounding them. All right. Next up, what are the controls in place to detect and prevent threats or exploitation of bot credentials? If we're tying them into our IAM, and I know from that jellyfish perspective, one of the first ones that I didn't actually go down was the SIM side. Are we tracking events and the information, obviously, as a result, and taking action? Similar that we would with either user accounts or privileged accounts. And if we're not, again, major problem. We're trying to fit this into our IAM, and the point being that this is a risk model. We want to reduce risk. The running joke that I have is the business wants return on investment, that's their ROI, but our ROI is risk of incarceration, right? Civil and criminal penalties that come out of breaches. All right. Next up, how do we manage bots? Managing other bots. This is the fun one too. We have to be very careful with that because once we get to the management layer with those bots, those have to be locked down really well. I'm going to once more pivot into the vendor side. Ugh, this is end of day, guys. I'm sorry, the caffeine's wearing off here. To pivot into the vendor side, you're seeing more and more of the vendors make deals, or I should say partnerships, with the companies from the bot perspective to do management. There's a certain one or two privileged account management, we'll just call them vendors right now, that have bots to manage those bots and all the rules and policies and procedures around it so that it comes out of the box locked down. Otherwise, you got a bigger challenge ahead of you, which is how are you going to manage what I'll call the elevated privileges around your bots? So fortunately, from a vendor perspective, there's less build, more buy becoming available. Okay? All right. Will our bots manage system service, non-human? Well, I kind of hit that one. Sorry. Will our bots manage our dev, test, and production environments? Here's another interesting one. A lot of the organizations out there do this horribly. You're all basically the same network in the end. Oh, yeah, no, we don't really have a true dev, or hey, test it uses production data, and they're all intermingled. And I love when I see a couple smiles out there because that means it's, yeah, you've seen it or you're seeing it. So we don't have a proper segregation. Well, this extends quite a bit now when you're talking about bots involved in it. Why? Because you're opening this up to even more. Somebody gets a hold of something that's not locked down from a bot perspective, and there's a good chance you're not going to know about it until it's way too late. So a precursor step is segregate your environments. Truly. Not even a bot thing. But if they're going to manage multiple environments, better not all be on the same network. All right, let's keep this going. How do we manage identity intelligence and analytics for our bots? And I don't know if you've noticed, but these are all tying back to the jellyfish, which is why I put the jellyfish first and foremost. How do we manage the identity intelligence and analytics for our bots? Are we adequately logging these access requests, the attempts, and any events to tie it back to the SIM piece? I know I feel like I'm repeating myself a little bit here and I'm beating this horse to death, but the point being that too many organizations are doing somewhat of a fire and forget methodology right now. They're putting them into place and they're not thinking about that risk side of the house. They're not tying it back to IAM. Had this discussion with a customer last week. They've already put bots out there. They got a ton of them. They're a financial institution. They're doing no management around them. I said, oh, well, we should be planning for that. I said, no. You should have planned for it before you did it. This goes back to don't buy software if you haven't run an effective process before. What are the requirements from a security point of view? Have you run that? What are the issues that you're looking to solve in that? Have you built what this needs to look like in the future, a future state? Have you actually taken it and said, here's what we need to do when, call it a roadmap if you would in this particular perspective, but have you laid out what needs to occur when in order to secure? And if you haven't, then you did the big mistake that a lot of orgs do, right? We go technology first, and we hammer in process data requirements second. Now, I don't want to go into too many details on that one, because hopefully you saw that in one of my 2 prior today sessions, because that's specifically what we spoke to. And if not, you're going to take my email address at the end. I'm going to email you those presentations, because they tie specifically to all of the prep work before this. Okay. Next up. How are we going to manage? Oh, I'm sorry. You know what I didn't do here, guys, real quick? I'm going to go back one. I don't know if you noticed this, but at the top, because I got 3 slides, they actually match the jellyfish. So administration and intelligence, we hit 2 of them. And now the access, which was auth N and auth Z, that's the next. Wow, cutting it close on time here. All right, how are we going to manage the authentication aspect? So we talked about this, so I'm not going to spend too much time. I promise you can have a copy of this too, guys. I'll give you a little more afterwards. Again, how are we managing password expiration? How are we managing changes? How are we managing those credentials around it? Hopefully we're not going shared set of credentials, but you may. If you're using a privileged account management tool, you may actually have a set of shared credentials. And similar to, let's say, an admin, or even from a system or service account, they may get checked in and checked out, or credentials may get injected. You may have one-time passwords. You may have all of these fun things we talked about at the beginning. Next up, do we have a separate password policy from that perspective for these bots? And the answer should hopefully be yes. Don't do the mistake that a lot of orgs do similar to systems and servers and the service side, where they set it once and nobody ever knows about it. Nobody ever changes it. There's no real management. If you do that, you're going to have a set of unexpiring passwords out there that nobody's tracking. All right. Next up. Do we have any single sign-on in place? Do we allow them to tap into that? Or alternatively, to manage it, but to tap into that, or multi-factor. Is there even a mechanism that we can use in this? And again, this comes down to the ever-changing role that's out there of the other technologies as they tie into bots. Again, PAM being one of the biggies right now, and PAM vendors that can do this. Well, can add to it, I should say, not the SSO, but from the PAM perspective. All right, next up, how do we manage the privilege access for these bots for the developer side? Because this is a fun one too. This, you got to be real careful. Who's got the elevated rights to build, change, etc.? Are bots. And if it's done out of your dev environment, test environment, first and foremost, you don't have that locked down well, guess what? Wide open for breach, for somebody to make changes, to do things that will actually make this bot a bad actor for you. Okay? And then from the authorization, great, what we allow it to do. Now, excuse me, we let it in the door, now what are we allowing it to do? And this is sort of the last piece of the puzzle. And in this case, again, we talked about, can you utilize a coarse-grained methodology, i.e. roles, or native role models like AD groups? Or do we need to take it one step further into strong authorization with, say, a policy or attribute-based access control or other similar type model? And the answer is very simple based on the criticality. If it's very highly critical, you want to have a fail deny type model in place so that these bots can't be used as bad actors and for unintended purposes. All right. Oh, I kind of just hit those last two. And then, of course, do you make sure that these fit into an SOD model? You do not want toxic combinations, and these need to be treated similarly speaking. You can't give a bot rights or entitlements that conflict. It's similar to when a human who can go in and write a check and sign a check. So nothing from the conflicting standpoint. All right. Well, I hit 0, of course, right when I hit the end. Anyways, so a couple of quick things. I know this one was a little more end of day, a little bit less. If you guys want a copy of this, we actually have this with more information in it. We had to trim it down because it wasn't a master class. It was a 20-plus minuter. Todd@IDMWORKS.com is my email. If you send me an email, not only will I give you the PowerPoint, but I'll give you the other aspects, the other pieces to extend this. The other thing is you're also welcome to come on up and grab a business card. I know we didn't get into questions, but because this is the last session, come on up. Myself, and you'll probably see a couple of our other guys come up. I have a feeling Dave will come up here in the back, Paul will come up, and we'll make sure to get your questions answered. All right, thank you guys for attending. I know this is tough at the end to jump into, and I know we got this gigantic room, but I appreciate it. Thank you guys.